friends, it's Unicorn, and today I am on the floor to bring you a more casual video because I want to do a try a chapter tag, the Booker Prize Longlist edition. I did one of these for the Women's Prize for Fiction this year and I really enjoyed it because I don't have time to read through all the long list, but this is a fun way for me to figure out which books that I'm interested in. Although by reading the blurb of them, I already have some books that I'm pretty sure that I want to read, but they are more to discover. I don't really follow a lot of new releases each year, so a lot of times in these book prices, all the books on the long list are unread to me, and this time is no exception. I haven't read any of the books on the long list. I did see a few titles that got really familiar to me because I've seen them everywhere, but some of the books are completely new to me. I was able to borrow 4 physical books from my library, and on top of that, I was also able to borrow 4 ebooks on my e-reader. So I'm going to read the first chapter of 8 books on the long list of Booker Prize. They are 13 books in total. I wasn't able to get 5 of them. Some of them my library doesn't have yet. So sometimes books published in the UK first, and then they will be published in America in some later days. And some of the books are held by millions of people and I have to wait for hundreds of days. So now, before I read the first chapter of them, let's talk a little bit about the 8 books that I have my hands on. The first book I have here is Glory by Novalet Blavio. This is a book that inspired by the fall of the president in Zimbabwe in November 2017 after nearly 4 decades of in power. The story is set in a fictional country where it was ruled by an old horse. The horse is a long-serving leader but failed unexpectedly. So it pretty much echoing the events in Zimbabwe. The setting reminds me of Animal Farm by George Orwell, of course, because animals and ruling and in power, but I've heard it's actually quite different from it, and it's inspired by a lot of folktales, fairy tales, and a lot of mythologies, so I'm really actually looking forward to this one. This author's debut novel, We Need New Names, was also longlisted or even shortlisted in the Man Booker Prize in 2013, so that added to some of my excitement for this book. And the second book I have here is Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This is a very short book. I think it's a little more than 100 pages. It's a historical fiction set in a small Irish village in 1985, where the protagonist is a coal merchant and also a family man, and in the weeks leading up to Christmas is his busiest week, and one morning when he was delivering some orders, he made some discovery that forces him to confront his past and also a silent town that was controlled by the church. This is, as I said, a lot of people already loved it, and I think the synopsis is really mysterious, and I think I'll read it no matter if it's on the long list or not, so I'm having high hopes for this one. Following, I borrowed Booth by Karen Joy Fowler. This is a historical fiction. It's also a retelling of the story of the family of John Wilkes Booth, who is the assassin that killed Abraham Lincoln back in the days. In this story, the Booth family moved to a secret cabin 30 miles outside of Baltimore in 1822. And the book follows them for the years after as they come together and break up as a family. Historical fiction is usually one of my favorite genres, but I have like some particular things that I don't really get along. For example, the retelling of some historical figures. The latest one I read was Hamlet, and I didn't get along with that book, so I'm a little bit nervous of this one, but we'll see. Following, I have The Trace by Percival Everest. This is a mystery thriller, which I don't see a lot on the long list, and some years they have mystery thrillers, but they don't tend to move forward that much. However, this is also a historical fiction, and I just love the synopsis of this, so I really have high hopes. So a series of brutal murders happened in a town in Mississippi, and a pair of detectives arrived in the town to investigate, but they also facing a lot of barriers as the local sheriff and the local people, especially the racist ones, they don't cooperate with the detective that much. And the real puzzle of these murders are in each crime scene there's a second body, a man that resembled Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a historical icon for the civil rights movement in America. He was murdered by a couple of white guys because he's a black guy and he was talking to this white woman one day, so he was murdered by the woman's brother and husband afterwards, and this case inspired some legislations about hate crime. And in this book, the detectives firstly thought this is a local serious murders, but afterwards they found out similar things are happened all around the nation, and they tried to take actions as the body piled up. And it sounds so intriguing. And now let's talk about the 4 books I borrowed on my e-reader. The first one is Oh William by Elizabeth Stroud. This is a contemporary fiction talking about a writer and also her husband. And the writer, although she writes a lot of stories and reads a lot of books, but her husband remains like a mysterious book and very hard to read. And one day her husband invited her going on an investigation about a family mystery. And the relationship between them are hard to describe. They're also like a lot of fictional couples that you don't know why they're still bonding. So to be honest, I'm not a big fan of reading about marriage and the marriage relationships, but I read Sorrow and Blessed this year earlier for the Women's Prize for Fiction. I wasn't interested in that book at first, but then it's an amazing ride when I was reading it. So I thought I won't go into this book thinking negatively, so let's see. And the second ebook I have is The Colony by Audrey McGee. I know even less about this one. It's a historical fiction that's set in Ireland in 1979. A British painter went to a small island on the west coast of Ireland, and he was very protective about his isolation and also his creativity. But at the same time, it seems like a bunch of people also know the existence of this island, or this island have some people who already lived in it. So they have some interesting observation of the island, to my understanding. Yeah, I don't really know a lot about this book. The second to the last book I'm gonna try a chapter with is Case Study by Graham McCormack Burnett. This is another mystery and historical fiction. We are getting a bunch of historical fiction here. It says in London in 1965, a young woman suspects that a psychotherapist drove her sister to suicide. So she created this new identity for herself and pretend to be a client. This book sounds so intriguing to me as I like a mystery and historical fiction. I love a combination of the two. I just hope that this book doesn't deliver a lot of paranormal things, which is not my type of tea, but we don't know, and I haven't seen anything, so maybe it's a legit historical fiction. The last book I have borrowed is Trust by Hernan Diaz. This is another historical fiction talking about the very rich people in Wall Street. To my understanding, and there are 4 narrators. 2 of them are a couple. They are the survivor of the financial crisis happened in the early of 20th century, and they are filthy rich, and things happened among them. You can tell from my description that I'm not very interested in this book already because I didn't even try to figure out what this book is about. And also I see different reviews of this book. Some people really love them, but the people who love reading this book, I don't tend to have the same reading taste with them. So I'm not very sure about this one, and I hope I will just try to read the first chapter and find out. So that's all the 8 books that I have borrowed from my library, and the goal is to have maybe 2 or 3 books that I want to continue reading and return the rest of the books to the library because I don't want to put other people on wait. If you didn't know that in library, even if you borrow the ebooks, ebooks. They also have a limited amount of copies of the ebooks for the library, so you still need to return the ebooks that you borrowed. It's not like unlimited. And I also take a peek into the first chapter of some of these books, and luckily they're not too long. Some of the first chapter are just like 4 or 5 pages, so it's very doable, and wish me luck. I'm gonna check in later. Hi, I am back with 2 first chapter read. The first one I read, Glory, and this is such a fun book, and by the blurb we know that the whole animal nation, fictional animal nation of course, is ruled by a very old horse, and in the first chapter it's actually a event that's happening in that nation. Is the celebration of the Independence Day, and in that chapter, like, there are also a lot of subtitles for like different actions that the people are taking. So these characters in bold, they're not the chapter name, they're just like a section where it highlighted some actions some of the characters are taking. And in the first chapter, basically all the animals are on a square and they are waiting patiently or impatiently for the old horse to appear and to start the celebration. And the whole celebration took place in the first chapter, and it's so bizarre and also very interesting because you see a lot of animals' thoughts are getting exaggerated, and each animal has their different backstories that is very intriguing, and I just can't wait to figure out. The first chapter is actually quite long, it's 31 pages, but I don't think it's long enough because I found myself wanting to continue reading after the first chapter. The first chapter of this book set a basic tone of that nation. It's pretty much ruled by one animal, and he is a dictator, and he is pretty brutal, but he also wants other animals to respect him, to love him, and he also sending out all the messages of how he is loving other animals. It's pretty much a default dictator, I feel like. And yeah, the whole celebration is just fascinating to read about, and a lot of people, not people, I kept saying people, but they are all animals. A lot of the animals, they have like different interesting personalities, animal personalities. Not a lot of action happened in the first chapter because they're all in the celebration, and we know that the old horse fell in the blurb, so we didn't know how that happened yet, so I'm really interested and eager to find out. But even with not a lot of actions take place in the first chapter, a lot of things and a lot of tones has already been told to you as a reader, so you actually know quite a bit of the country already. And also the writing style is just so fun to read about. I like reading the bold characters in the chapter and to see how some of them are really ironic and some of them are really funny. So yeah, I think I'm gonna continue to read this book. This will be the first one that I will be for sure to continue reading. After I had such a good time with Glory, I thought I'll just continue with a book that I'm not very interested in. So I read the first chapter of Trust. So in Trust, there are 4 narrators, and one of them is called Benjamin Rusk, and he is pretty much one of the wealthy rich people. And the first chapter is his background story about how his family moved to America and how he was brought up by his parents, and it's pretty dry. And I have learned a lot about my reading taste. I'm not good with reading rich people's stories, whether they are Hollywood stars or like people from the Wall Street, of course. So yeah, I just feel like it reads like a Wikipedia of Benjamin Rusk, which is not very interesting, and I'm not in particularly very interested in character like this, so I'm gonna just pass this book and return it to the library. Hi, I'm back with another update. I have read the first chapter of Small Things Like These and the first chapter of Case Study. And first, let me talk about Small Things Like These. The first chapter is literally only 4 pages, and the book is 119 pages. So, and the font is like this big, so it's not a long book, not a long first chapter. And the first chapter basically like didn't tell me anything. So I read a little bit further into the second chapter. So again, the first chapter is just like first and second chapter is just like setting everything up, and we know the protagonist and his story of a little bit of his upbringing as well. I don't think the book told me a lot about the man. We just know that he is a person that in the coal business, and also he lives with his wife, and he had a hard childhood. So yeah, I'm not really sure, although I did plan to read this book no matter what, because it's just so small, and I also heard so many good things about it. I actually saw it everywhere as well. So yeah, but in terms of reading for the try a chapter tag, I think normally I wouldn't continue with a book like this if I didn't know more about it. But since I've already decided to read the whole book before this tag, I'm still gonna read it. But just to want to make a note here that I don't plan to read this book for the sake of try a chapter tag. I plan to read this book because I heard amazing reviews of it, but it didn't show from the first chapter for sure. And then I read the first chapter of Case Study, which is a ebook that I borrowed from the library. And the problem with ebook is you don't really see the formatting of the story. So to my understanding of the format of the ebook, the first chapter could be just an introduction of the narrator, or could be super long with a piece of like article that the narrator read in between. So I'm really not sure. So I read the whole thing with the narrator's journal, and then the article that she read, and also some things happened. So I thought it's like a sandwiched first chapter, although that could be 3 chapters. I'm not sure. The whole thing is just talking about the narrator thought that the psychotherapist killed her sister. It's not like clearly like he murdered her sister, but she thought the psychotherapist did something to the mind of her sister, and her sister ended up suicide. So she tries to investigate. She also read a journal of the doctor, of the psychotherapist. That's the thing that I said sandwiched in between. It's like a doctor's note of the therapist, and talking about a patient called Dorothy, which the narrator thought assembled her sister. So she read the story of Dorothy, and she decided to investigate and go meet the therapist, and she indeed went on the first chapter, on the third half of the first chapter or the third chapter. So the 2 main characters apparently met already at this point, and I just feel like the narrator is very interesting because so far she didn't really know a lot about this therapist besides the public information, and she's speculating a lot about the therapist. So every action that this psychotherapist take, she has her own interpretation, and I feel like that's something to play on as a book. And also she has some very peculiar behavior or habit as well. For example, she mentioned that when she goes back to home, she never take the same route. So every day, she took like a different road to go back to home. So she definitely has something interesting going on as well. And at this point, I'm very curious to see what's gonna develop from a story that has a very interesting setting, but at the same time, I'm not so eager to, like when I read The Glory, that I have to continue reading it right now. So I'm not sure. So I'm gonna put this book on the maybe pile. I'm back with another update of 2 of the first chapters that I read, and the first book I read is Booth. This book surprised me. Before the main body of the story, the book has like a prologue kind of thing. It's only like 6 pages, and after that there were like 2 pages of things that influenced Abraham Lincoln in his view of slavery and all of that, I think. And the first chapter is basically just talking about the family of Booth, and I don't know if it's the writing or something else or the atmosphere, but I was like drawn in immediately. And it's talking about how the family was hidden in a secret place, and they are having babies. The whole family was having babies year after year. The thing is, every child in their family, they didn't know the outside world. They thought the whole world was the world of their family and their secret location. They didn't know anything about what's going on outside and what's about that. And I think it's a pretty default and standard code description, but I don't know, it's just the writing. Actually, when I read the sentence like after 17 years, I was kind of disappointed because I thought the book was about those 17 years, how they brought up the babies, but no, the 17 years was just passed by one sentence. It's like after a long time. But it was also very intriguing in that way because by stating that 17 years has already passed, you got a bunch of little characters that knows nothing about what's going on in America, and they are apparently influenced by their parents, and yeah, it's so intriguing. I think it's like almost like the book has some magic powers that draw me in. Yeah, I think I'm definitely gonna read it and see how the story of the Booth family tied up with Lincoln's story and his tragic assassination. And then I went ahead and read the first chapter of The Colony, which is interesting on the sense of formatting yet again because I borrowed the ebook, so I'm not quite sure how the book was presented on paper, but apparently the book has a lot of poetry running in between, and the first chapter was just talking about the painter, and he rented a boat and a boatman to go to this place that he read in the book, and he was just having this conversation with the boatman. I'm not particularly interested in their conversation, and because of the format of the poetries, I wasn't able to fully enjoy it and appreciate the formatting. Yeah, not many to say about the first chapter of Colony. I'm pretty sure at this point I'm not gonna continue reading, at least for this e-copy. Maybe in the future, if I want to borrow the physical copy or if it made into the shortlist, I'll have a second look at this book. Hi friends, I'm back with the last check-in of this video. I have read the first chapter of The Trees and Oh William. And in the first chapter of The Trees, we get this family in the town in Mississippi, and it's more like a slice of life of this family, and in the end of the chapter we know that somebody has died and people are apparently grieving in the whole chapter. It just tells us the characters of the story, and I'm sure that they are not even the main characters because I was when I was reading the blurb, it says the main characters was the two detectives. And in the first chapter, it's just talking about the victims, it seems like. And I don't really know about my feelings depend on the first chapter to this book. I wasn't particularly drawn into the story yet. I think everything haven't like started to develop yet, so I couldn't tell. Based on the first chapter, for the sake of the first chapter, try a chapter tag, I'm gonna put this book down and maybe like pick it up for some other reasons later because I am interested in the blurb. It's just like it didn't show a lot in the first chapter. And then I read the first chapter of Oh William, and it's interesting because I thought it's a story about a couple, but turned out they are already really old and they already divorced for a long time. And the writer, who's called Lucy, is basically recount her story with her first husband, William, and the divorce is not even a spoiler, it's literally the first sentence, like my ex-husband William. And she was talking about how they met and the things that happened in a little bit in their marriage, and she also tells us something about each of their marriages and how she took on his name after the first marriage and how they both have like other marriages after. You got the sense of they don't communicate that well, and William apparently have some thing that is like in his heart that bothers him for a long time because he has this terrors like he imagines or like nightmares. But that's pretty much it. I'm not very interested in reading about people's relationships, and the story so far hasn't really developed like some major conflicts of like dramas or whatsoever. So yeah, I'm gonna pass on this book as well. So now I have read the first chapter of the 8 books that I was able to borrow. I have to say that the one book I'm definitely going to be continue is The Glory. This is such a peculiar setting, a peculiar format of a story, and I got so excited reading the first chapter of this already, and it's fairly long, so you got the sense of the story, and I just can't wait to see how the whole nation react when the old horse dies and what's going to happen to all the other animals. And it really gives you the vibe of Animal Farm because it's an animal kingdom, but at the same time it's also very different. Well, I won't spoil you on the Animal Farm, but this is like a completely different story. So yeah, I'm really interested in reading this. And then the other book I didn't expect that I want to continue reading is Booth, because I was not very good at reading historical figures, but the writing of Booth is really good. I read the first chapter, it's not long, but I already like the writing, and also it created some mysterious situation that I want to figure out. So yeah, I'm gonna continue reading this as well. And I think I put the case study on a maybe tell, but after I read all of this, I think maybe case study will be the 3rd book that I'm gonna continue because it intrigues me enough that I want to continue with the story, and it has a lot of elements that I like. And the last book I want to talk about here is Small Things Like These. I think I'm just gonna read it because it's just really small, and although the first chapter didn't say a lot about this, and I didn't plan to continue with this book, only depends on its first chapter. I heard so many good things about this book, so I think this book is the one that I will finish reading no matter if I like the first chapter or not, and it turned out to be the case that I plan to finish reading, although the first chapter didn't provide me a lot of information. So yeah, I think I have those 3.5 books that I decided to continue on. Please stay tuned for the reviews of those books that I chose, and I do plan to read more on the shortlist when it comes out in September. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know any of your thoughts about the books that I mentioned. Have you read any of them? Do you have any recommendations? And please don't forget to say hi in the comment section down below. Thumbs up to this video if you liked it. Until next time, happy reading, stay healthy and safe.